I'm going to talk about some social science research results. That's what I'm going to do, but I think you'll find that there are insights here which I think are relevant very much to what we're all talking about. This is a project that was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council over the last 3 years. We did the first project, which was the Brighton Fuse, and we just finished the second project, which is on the freelancer sector, which is Brighton Fuse 2, and I have some reports here, if you would like to take them. So it's a project between ourselves, the University of Brighton and University of Sussex, and our business partner, Wired Sussex, who play a role very similar to what Joe and Anne-Marie are doing here, working as an intermediary with the local sector in creative digital IT industries, promoting events like this and training and so forth. We've done essentially, I'm not going to talk a lot about the research methods that we've done, but I don't know any other study of a cluster that was so detailed in terms of the research design. We've done 3 surveys now and had over 1,000 responses to those surveys. We've done over 100 face-to-face interviews that have all been recorded and coded and categorized in qualitative data analysis software. So we know the cluster very well, and we've developed a method for trying to get a sense of what the economic contribution of these sectors is, and this idea of fusion of arts, technology, of arts and digital technology. So this is, I'm going to talk about, I've just talked about the research methods to the extent that I will, a little bit about the data overview of the sample, what the fusion idea is in terms of skills, something about the freelancers project in particular, their lifestyles, and something about the nature of place and networking, and finally the conclusions and policy recommendations that we made. So first of all, a sense of the economic performance. This is what the policymakers are always interested in, and usually people skip to this point about levels of income generation. In terms of, this is the freelancer sector. In the first survey that we did on the firms, we found they were generating, of the ones that had replied, which was over 500 firms to our first survey, they were generating over £310 million in revenues. And this is the results from the freelancer sector. And I mean, the first thing to note is that it's quite a diversified sector, right? We have over here the consultants, knowledge-based intensive services, digital technologies, this is more the STEM, science, technology, engineering, programming and so forth. Marketing, we get into design, and down into content, digital content creation and so forth, and the arts and crafts there at the end. And one of the things we had to do here was to normalize for the full-time equivalents, because not everybody who's a freelancer is working full-time, right? So we had to normalize to assume as if they did, which is the lime green here. So we think they're doing rather well in terms of prosperity. And you know, the subtext to this is that a lot of the research on freelancers and a lot of the policy discussions are that, you know, the self-employed is kind of a second best status, right? That these are people that really ought to have proper jobs. People that have been made redundant and so forth, and are not receiving the benefits that they would do as employees, and so people worry about this in terms of policy concerns. So I think, you know, what we've been able to show here is like a very positive message, actually, that actually these people are doing really rather well. We've been impressed at the fact that they're extremely good at business promotion and marketing. You find people managing multiple brands of their business. They are very savvy entrepreneurs, in effect, and very often the comparison is that freelancers are compared to employees of firms. Well, actually, we think they're much more akin to entrepreneurs and managing directors of firms, in that they take on projects and then they think about how to resource the projects, they bring on other collaborators and freelancers to help, doing all the business functions, accountancy, strategy, leadership, branding and so forth. Very business-like, business-minded individuals. This is a quote from one of them. I wasn't really thinking of myself as a freelancer, even though that's what I was doing. I thought of myself as a company founder. You know, these are people that are very much entrepreneurs. And we find the average income in terms of the median normalised for full-time equivalent is about £42,000, which we think is pretty good, right? So this is the median. So remember, half of the sample are above this and half are below. So I don't know what you think, but that sounds pretty good to me. And high growth, right? Growth rates of income of over 7%. During a recession, by the way. So again, which was similar to what we found with the firms. In fact, the firms were doing even better in terms of employment growth and revenues growing at something like 14% in the survey that we'd done 2 years earlier. So these are high growth sectors, of course, and these, you know, we're not talking here about cleaners and people in massage services and lorry drivers and all those various types of freelance, self-employed people. But certainly in these sectors, it's a much rosier picture than the one you often hear about the dismal status of freelancers. This shows revenues by region this is all within the Brighton and Hove city region, right? So what we find, and this is quite similar to the firms survey that we did previously, but what we do find with the freelancers is that the local market and the London market are even more important to them, are generating significant revenues. But also we start to see, you know, nearly 25% are earning significant revenues overseas as well in international markets. So that will be, some have international clients, international projects, but also all those micro payments that people are making on online sites, right? Which could be designers selling material goods through their online sites, and that will all be included in these international statistics as well. Innovation. So we also find that in these sectors, we find high levels of innovation. In terms of the firms, we found 99% are doing some form of innovation over a period of a year. And these are the same questions that you'll find in the Community Innovation Survey, which is process innovations, marketing, product, training, implementing new equipment, and so forth. Tends to be the kind of innovation, it's not so much patenting R&D in the formal traditional sense. It tends to be more service-oriented, design-oriented, paying attention to the needs of clients and so forth, and modifying user interfaces, this kind of thing. But innovations nevertheless, right? And we find in the Community Innovation Survey, which is a census that happens every 5 years within Europe, there's a rump of something like 45% of firms that do no innovation at all. So they're asked, are you doing any product innovation? No. Are you doing process? No. Are you doing service? No. Nothing. And these are not basket cases, right? These are firms that are continuing to be stable and they're functional. But nevertheless, here we find that almost all the firms and the freelancers are doing some form of innovation. So about this fusion idea on skills, and we've heard before, seems to be a theme of this the afternoon session, that we're talking a lot about interdisciplinarity and breaking down boundaries between disciplines. And that was very much part of the agenda that we were interested in here, and the degree to which the arts and humanities and digital technology combine to produce business growth and economic contribution. And what we find in both the firms and the freelancers is they fall into three groups. There's the first group, which we call the unfused, which are very specialized in the services that they offer to clients. And then you find the group that we call fused, who are starting to make use of integration and the combination of these skill sets in their services and offerings to clients. And then we have the superfused, who are very highly reliant on this kind of integration and combination in what they do. And we find here the population of firms versus freelancers. And it's interesting to see, you know, that actually for the freelancers, we find there's even more that are reporting that they are superfused than the firms. Which is interesting, right? Because you think of it, you can imagine it in terms of an organization, particularly in something like content for animation or video games or something like that, where you will have You'll have designers and programmers, and you'll have content developers, artists, animation people, as well as producers, who are represented by different employees. And we were rather more surprised at some of the other sectors like digital marketing, where they started off in the 90s doing things like search engine optimization and started to add more of these creative skills like social media and web design and copywriting, all those people that write all the cheeky tweets that attract consumers to brands, right? And not understanding only the segmentation of markets, but also understanding, what attracts consumers and what they want next and how to get them to buy things, right? So, and this is very much the sensibilities of the arts and humanities, right? So we find in terms of the entrepreneurs of the firms, 46% of the managing directors, the founder entrepreneurs, had degrees in arts, design and humanities. So it's a very much, in terms of the pool of entrepreneurial talent, it's a very much fused kind of a profile. And you can imagine that with these organizations, when it scales down to one individual, that becomes interesting, right? So think about how then do you present yourself as a freelancer? Because you've probably heard this advice yourselves, that in these sort of mentoring workshops, that you shouldn't present yourself as being able to do everything, right? You shouldn't be a jack of all trades or a Jill of all trades, right? You should be saying that this is what I specialize at, this is what I'm very good at, I don't do this, I don't do that, I can get somebody else that will help you with that. So we had a lot of discussion about exactly what that means in terms of the superfused individual and these skill sets. So one of the measures we have of this is the way that people spend their time. And without worrying too much about all the detail here, I mean, it just shows that people are spending significant time on these various activities of coding and programming, as against design and producing content and artworks and management and so forth. There's, we have technologists doing content and creative work. We have creative people doing some coding. It is very much, in terms of activities, a superfused kind of profile. But how does this affect performance? So this is in terms of economic performance and comparing the firms and the freelancers. So in the first Brighton Fuse project on the firms, the big result was really this one here, the superfused firms, that we found that they were growing. This is growth rates. They were growing 3 times faster than the unfused firms, right? So you earn more money in moving from unfused to fused to superfused, but not only that, the growth rates are far higher. And we also find with the freelancers, right, that similarly the income increases from unfused to fused to superfused, but then when you start to get to superfused, you actually find that instead of growing more, they actually grow less as superfused independent professionals. So that's kind of an interesting difference, and we've talked a lot about that and why that is. And we think it's partly due to the natural limits to growth of individuals. These are individuals, so it's hard to generate a lot of projects. How much more business do you want to take on if you're at a stage where you're really hyper talented? And one of the quotes we had is that people that are superfused in the cluster, they're called unicorns, right? They're very rare. And if you get to that level, then probably you don't want to work all the time that God gives you, right? I think that's another issue here, that behind all this agenda, there's always this assumption of jobs growth and economic growth, and very often entrepreneurs and freelancers don't necessarily want to work more, they want to work less, and they want to do other projects which may be monetizable at some point down the road. And they could just be producing artworks, they could be having side projects like families, for example, and pursuits like that. So I think there's some of that coming in here as well, in terms of the reasons why the superfused freelancers are not growing so much, even though they're making significant amounts of money. And where do these skills come from? So we have the top 3 channels of skills that people draw on in their everyday working life: learning on the job, self-learning, and the higher education degree. we were pleased to see that as the universities, that the degree still has a role, and somewhat surprised because of the importance of self-learning, and in particular we hear this again and again, that formal training is not really necessary for most technical skills these days. You can go onto Google. Here's a nice quote from one of our interviews. The world's full of blogs and people telling you exactly how to solve all sorts of weird, obscure problems that you've never come across before. You can do huge amounts of self-learning, and you don't need formal learning processes. And no doubt you've seen this yourself, that when you have a particular technical problem, you could just Google it and you'll find a forum or several forums and possibly a video that's showing you exactly how to solve that problem. And you don't necessarily need to sign up for a course and pay for a course to learn how to do this particular technique. So there are questions here for higher education institutions, and how do we fit in with the world of MOOCs and online learning and Google and YouTube and so forth, and what role do we have? And the role that people are saying is that they do learn a lot of the softer personal people skills, management skills, these kinds of things you can learn through degrees, through group work and teamwork and so on. And it's not really our job to be teaching people the latest versions of Maya and 3ds Max and these sorts of tools that you can really learn by yourself. This was the breakdown in terms of degree. As I said, this is the freelancers. So arts and humanities and design are even more important in this population than in the firm population. But highly educated workforce, of course. Even we got business and economics is kicking in here. So the business schools are contributing as well, which is nice. So let's talk about life a little bit, and motivation, and well-being. This is partly because there's a lot of work which looks at freelancers as people, as I was saying, that maybe are in a disadvantageous position relative to their clients, and people worry about their well-being, and there are studies that show that people have high levels of stress in the creative industries, particularly as freelancers, and are exploited and would be better off if they had jobs in organizations and had more formal employment. So we thought we'd test out this with some questions around here. This is I call this the Danish pastry chart from our designers. You've heard about pie charts, but this is the Danish pastry chart. What this shows essentially is that it's much more about aspirations, the reasons why people are freelancing, right? It's not about necessity. It's not because people have lost their jobs. And we had a lot of media coverage from this project back in January when we launched, and there was an article in the Sunday Times that quoted me on the report, and the headline of that was "Getting sacked is the road to bliss," because I'd said that a lot of people had said that they had been made redundant in previous years, and that was the best thing that ever happened to them. Right? It wasn't quite the message we were trying to get across, that getting sacked is the road to bliss, especially with our bosses reading, right? So, but nevertheless, you do find that there are some people that are, have been made redundant and would prefer to be in a freelance position, but they're in the minority. Most of them are doing it in order to realize their own aspirations and to grow and realize their own plans. And some are doing it to earn more money, There was a nice quote here. It's almost like a conspiracy with the freelancers. It's like, why should we be long-term? Why should we take a lower day rate? And the more interviews you do with these people, you start to think, why on earth would you have a job? Why would you work for someone else who tells you what to do and takes overheads off you? And you come into work and you have tasks that someone else is telling you to do. It does make you wonder. Enough on that. On well-being, we asked people a lot of the same social psychological questions that you get in these sorts of happiness surveys, and what we find here is that the creative digital IT freelancers in Brighton are about as happy as everybody else. In similar populations in the creative industries and in self-employment and in the population in general, there are no statistically significant differences. If anything, they're slightly more happy and slightly more anxious, which is It might be the freelancer's sort of personality type. I don't know. You know, I know some people that are only happy if they're anxious. You probably know people like that. But that's what we find, right? So in terms of plans for the future, keep working as self-employed, 95% say. So, you know, this is not people that are desperately going through all the job sites looking to get back into regular employment. There we have it. So I think that's a good answer to these questions about, you know, is this a displaced workforce, essentially? You know, kind of reserve army of labour that is an effect of the recession? I think this is a clear answer that we have to start getting used to this structural change in the economy, that year on year we've had this growth in self-employment. It's a structural change and it's growing and it's not going away. And so we have to start thinking about how do we design policies and think about the economy that includes this sector and this mode of working. But they are not without barriers and challenges, of course, and you can probably guess which are the most important ones: irregular income, the economic climate, difficulties getting paid promptly, of course, by clients. And there is a whole issue, I think, around the lack of benefits, the lack of formal entitlements that you would have as an employee that you don't have as a freelancer. We need to equalize those, I think, in policy terms. And some of these things can be addressed by policy, and in other cases, I think the policies are already there in place, but freelancers don't really know about them, right? And they don't really know how to take somebody to small claims court, or don't really want to, for fear of appearing to be trouble. But nevertheless, there are existing policies that can help with many of these issues, I think, and part of it is about awareness and information. So a little bit on place of work and networking. So you know the Richard Florida argument, which is that you have an attractive place, which is quality of life, and people are attracted there who are a little bit more bohemian, that are graduates, and from there you start to get the innovation and growth. And this is very much the story that we found in the first fuse with Brighton. People come for the quality of life. They come for the beach, they come for the festivals, the culture, creative reputation, the fact that it's near to London and so forth. They don't come because there's a creative digital cluster there and the employment opportunities. But once they're there, then they set up and they start to become entrepreneurs and so on. So that's the classic Richard Florida sequence. So here we have a little more detail on the freelancers here. 89% work at home, right? And there's a lot of freelancers don't get out much. You may have noticed. It's kind of sad. They complain about a sense of isolation and feeling lonely, and many of them work in their bedroom at home and so forth. Others work in co-working spaces, which are becoming increasingly important, and there are several of these in Brighton. And people get work through that and contacts, and they really stress the benefits of working in these types of co-working spaces. But not many are. 12% are working in some mysterious other place, and so forth. And this relates to this whole idea about communities. And what we hear about clusters is that people are attracted to clusters because of all the other creative people there and the skills that are available, and that's true, and everybody stresses how important that is. Nevertheless, we find here, you know, over half the freelancers don't feel part of any community, which I think, you know, is related to this other point about the fact that they're working at home and not getting out so much, although there are all kinds of meetups and festivals, and for the artists there are life drawing sessions, and there are hackathons for the programmers, and the designers all meet up in a pub every Wednesday. But nevertheless, people are not generally, the majority are not making use of these kinds of amenities. They're not really mixing so much. You know, we find that 14% do identify with the creative community, 8% with the digital, 26% feel part of both, and we find it's those superfused ones that really do identify with both types of communities. But there are these contradictions, right? That everybody says that networking is extremely important, but hardly anybody does it, right? So maybe you found this in some of your regions. There we are. Conclusions. So what we found in terms of the freelancers, They are on average prosperous. They're enjoying good income growth and good levels of well-being. They are more superfused than the firms in this combination of arts with technology, but with more limited growth, and that raises questions about their motivations and modes of working. They largely prefer to freelance, and they do so because of the aspirations that they have and the exciting plans that they want to expand on and realize. And they do experience barriers around money, things particularly related to the freelancing condition and around skills as well. And we have various policy recommendations falling out of this. I mean, the first one is around the kind of equal rights with employees. We say, and particularly there are some obvious ones here like maternity, paternity leave, right? There's no reason why tax-paying freelancers should not have the same benefits in terms of maternity and paternity leave as employees, and that ought to be something that ought to be fixed. But what you find, of course, is that all these policies, industrial policies and business policies, things like creative industry tax relief, they're all written with companies in mind, right? In order to get creative industry tax relief, you have to have a registered company, which is not a big deal, and we find that 40% of the freelancers have that anyway, right? It's not a big deal to set up a company. But I think it illustrates the kind of the mindset, right? That policymakers think in terms of firms. They don't think in terms of these individuals, which they need to increasingly do so because they, as I say, they're not going away, they're increasing. There are issues around access to finance, and this is not the usual kind of venture capitalist business angel type arguments that we hear in terms of firms, but this is more about things about having cash flow to deal with those issues of not getting paid on time, having a bank manager that understands, right? So we're advocating a new kind of freelancer-friendly bank account, which could be run out of Lloyd's or something like that, which is government-backed, where you'd have advice on long-term planning and planning for pension, this type of thing, and also would understand some of the fluctuations of volatility in the freelance life. And then there's a whole issue, I think, around awareness and value. You know, we hear, this is a nice quote, you feel like you're justifying your fees all the time to people. You know, people in the general public, clients, don't understand how much time and effort it takes to design a website and to do illustrations and to optimize your search engine exposure. So I think we need a public information campaign about that to try and get people to understand in terms of the client side. But even on the startup side, in terms of the freelancers themselves, they need to understand how to set rates and what the business models are available to them. And really, this is something that is not really talked about among freelancers, about how much do you charge for particular items and services. So I think we need some real research on that in terms of benchmarking, in terms of valuation of contribution. And so I'll just finish here. There's been a huge amount of interest from this work, particularly the client, obviously, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, was really quite happy with the results, because I mean what we've shown is actually that there's an economic rationale for funding the arts and humanities, right? That it's not just about STEM subjects, it's not just about science, technology, engineering, maths, but the arts and humanities are very much part of that combination which produces the growth in the creative digital economy that we all like to see. And we've had three government ministers from different ministries refer to our work. We have a new digital catapult centre in Brighton on the back of this. We've had the 170 million city deal announced by the Deputy Prime Minister last year, who referred to the Fuse work as a way to understand what's actually happening in terms of the high growth cluster there. And in terms of this self-employed one, you start to see the minister saying that the self-employed clearly play a key role in driving the culture of innovation in the creative industries. And so I think that's the value of doing this kind of work. I think that you can really expose what is a kind of a hidden contribution in the freelancers, and it's difficult to do that. It's difficult to build up a sample There's no sort of registered database of freelancers that you can go to, so you have to sort of piece it together bottom up from meetup groups and co-working spaces. It's difficult to do. Once you can do that, you can start to see, reveal the whole contribution, and then start to think about how can you support it, and what policies do you need to remove barriers and to stimulate it and help it to innovate and grow more. So I'll leave it there.